He had always lived far away from the noise of the world, in a quiet place where the air smelled of soil and pine trees. People who visited the forest rarely came near his small wooden house because the path was hidden between tall bushes and old stones. He liked it that way. Life felt calmer when there was no rush, no cars, no distractions, just the sound of birds, flowing water, and the wind moving through the trees. Every morning he walked out with a small bag, checked his traps, collected firewood, and made sure everything around him was the same as the day before. But one morning, things were not the same. He woke up to a strange noise that he had never heard before. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't an airplane. It was a sharp tearing sound, something cutting across the sky like metal being dragged across stone. His first thought was that maybe a large meteor had fallen nearby. He stepped outside, expecting to see smoke in the distance, but the sky only held a thin trail of silver that slowly faded. The air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He stood still for a long moment, listening. No birds, no rustling leaves. The forest was completely silent, and that alone made him uneasy. Any hunter or forest worker knew that when animals went quiet, something unusual was happening. He tightened the strap of his bag and began walking toward the direction the sound had come from. The forest was thicker on that side, full of uneven ground and twisted roots. It took him a while to move through it. As he walked deeper, he noticed broken branches and marks on the ground, as if something heavy had dragged across the soil. But the trail didn't look like the marks of a fallen tree. It was something else, smooth, deep, almost melted in places. He followed the trail for several minutes until he smelled something strange in the air. It reminded him of heated metal mixed with a sharp chemical scent he couldn't recognize. He slowed down and moved carefully, steps soft on the ground. When he finally looked through the trees and saw the thing lying in the clearing, he froze. It was not a plane. It was not a helicopter. It was nothing he had ever seen in his life. A large object sat half buried in the earth, shaped like a curved shell with glowing lines across its surface. Parts of it were cracked, and faint smoke rose from those cracks. Small sparks flickered near the edges, like tiny blue stars. Every part of the object looked too smooth, too perfect, too advanced to belong to humans. His first instinct was to back away, but curiosity held him in place. He did not move closer at first. Instead, he circled the clearing slowly, looking for anything dangerous, fire, moving parts, or someone who might be hurt. When he reached the other side, he saw something that made him forget all fear. A figure lay on the ground near the broken craft. For a second, he thought it might be a person wearing strange clothes, but as he stepped closer, he realized the figure did not look human at all. The body was shaped like a human body. Yes, arms, legs, a face, but the skin had a soft shimmer, almost like moonlight reflecting on water. The hair was long and smooth, silver with streaks of dark blue, and the clothing, if it could be called clothing, looked like a layer of thin light wrapped around her. She wasn't moving. He knelt slowly, heart beating faster. Even though she looked different, he could still see the obvious signs: the rise and fall of shallow breaths, the small tension in her hands, the wound on her shoulder where something had torn through. She was alive but weak. He didn't know what to do. There was no rule book for something like this. Should he run? Should he call someone? But who would believe him? And what if calling the authorities meant she would be treated like an experiment? The thought bothered him. No living being, no matter how different, deserved that. He gently touched her wrist to check if she reacted. Her skin felt cooler than a human's, but not cold. When he lifted her hand slightly, her fingers twitched as if she sensed him. She wasn't dangerous, at least not right now. She needed help. He looked at her wound again. The strange shimmering layer around her body was dimmer in that injured area, almost flickering like a dying flame. He didn't understand the technology, but he understood one thing clearly. She was hurt and alone. He glanced at the damaged craft. More cracks appeared, and a faint sound came from inside, almost like a machine losing power. Whatever the craft was, it didn't look like it would stay stable for long. Staying near it felt risky, and leaving her here felt wrong. He took a deep breath and made a decision. He gently lifted her, being careful with her injured arm. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless. Her head rested against his shoulder, and for a moment he felt her body tense, as if she was trying to wake up. But she remained unconscious. The walk back to his cabin took longer than usual, not because of her weight, but because he moved slowly, making sure he didn't trip or slip on the uneven ground. Her breathing stayed soft, sometimes uneven, sometimes steady. Once, he felt her fingers tighten weakly around the fabric of his shirt, as if she was trying to hold on to something familiar. Even though she didn't know him at all, when he finally reached his home, he laid her gently on his bed. The cabin was simple wooden walls, a small stove, a shelf with herbs and bandages, and a lantern hanging near the door. The place felt so ordinary compared to the impossible situation unfolding inside it. He washed his hands, lit another lantern for better light, and began examining her wound more carefully. It wasn't like any injury he had treated before. The edges of the wound weren't torn like normal flesh. They looked as if light itself had been split. He cleaned it with warm water first, moving slowly so he didn't cause her pain. She winced slightly, which told him she could feel what he was doing. He whispered soft words, even though he knew she couldn't understand. "You're going to be all right. I'm just trying to help." He used clean cloth to wrap the area, then placed another folded cloth under her head for support. She kept. Her eyes closed, but her breathing grew steadier, as if the simple human treatment eased some of her pain. Hours passed. He sat beside her, watching her carefully. Sometimes he stepped outside to check the forest, making sure no one or nothing had followed them. Every time he returned, she remained still, but there were small changes. Her fingers moved slightly, her lips parted as she took deeper breaths, and the faint shimmering around her body grew brighter. At one point, as the sun began setting, she finally opened her eyes. He froze, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes were unlike anything he had seen, bright, deep, almost reflecting galaxies. She looked around with confusion at first, then at the ceiling, then at him. When she tried to sit up, she winced at the pain, and he quickly raised a hand, gently motioning for her to stay down. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe here." She didn't understand the words, but something in his tone made her relax a little. She blinked slowly, studying his face, almost trying to understand what kind of being was helping her. When she placed a hand over her bandaged wound, her expression softened. She understood enough to realize he had treated her injury. She whispered something in a language he couldn't recognize, smooth, melodic, full of sounds no human mouth could naturally produce. Her voice was weak, but carried emotion, a mixture of fear, gratitude, and exhaustion. He shook his head lightly to signal he didn't understand. She watched him for a while, then pointed at him, then at the room, then gently placed her hand over her heart. It was a gesture of trust, simple and ancient. He nodded slowly, feeling a sense of responsibility settle inside him. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know why she had come to this world or how far she had traveled. But he knew one thing. Clearly, she needed help, and fate had chosen him of all people to be the one standing beside her in this strange moment. Outside, the forest slowly returned to normal. Crickets began singing again. The wind carried the scent of night-blooming flowers, and the sky grew dark with stars. But inside that small wooden cabin, Something completely extraordinary was unfolding, something that would change his quiet life forever. And for now, all he could do was sit beside her, watch over her, and hope that when she woke again, she would feel safe enough to stay alive until she could tell her story. After a few hours, she began to stir more actively. Her eyes opened wider, showing a mixture of fear and curiosity. She didn't speak words he could understand, but her gaze searched him carefully, as if trying to decide whether he was a threat. He stayed perfectly still, letting her examine him, knowing that sudden movements could frighten her. The room was quiet except for the faint crackle of the fire in the small stove. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, brushing the leaves, but inside, the atmosphere felt tense. He could feel her trembling slightly, not just from weakness, but from shock. She had survived a crash that would have killed most beings, yet her eyes carried the weight of pain and disbelief. He offered her some water in a small cup. She hesitated at first, looking at the liquid as if it were strange and dangerous. Slowly, her hand reached for it, her long, delicate fingers brushing the cup, then gripping it lightly. When she drank, she did so carefully, and he could see her eyes relax just a little. That small act told him she trusted him, even though she could not say it in words. As the night grew darker, he decided he needed to understand more. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but one thing was clear: she was intelligent. She observed everything he did, the way he moved, how he cleaned her wound, how he lit the lanterns. Sometimes she mimicked his small gestures, as if testing the limits of her own abilities or trying to communicate in her way. He tried speaking to her gently. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're safe here. I promise." His voice was calm, steady, but he could tell she didn't understand the words. She tilted her head slightly, a small movement, almost like a nod of recognition, not of understanding, but of acknowledgement. Over the next few hours, he realized that gestures were more effective than words. Pointing to the food he had prepared, showing her the water, even patting the bed beside her to invite her to rest, she responded to these actions. Slowly, a pattern emerged. She began to mirror his gestures, showing him her own attempts at communication. She drew shapes in the dust on the wooden floor with her fingers. The shapes were strange, flowing, and intricate, not like any alphabet he had ever seen. But they were deliberate, purposeful. He didn't understand their meaning, yet he sensed they were important to her. At one point, she tried to speak again. This time, her voice was stronger, but it was a series of soft musical tones that rose and fell like wind through trees. He listened carefully, feeling the vibration of the sounds in the small cabin. Though he could not understand her words, her tone carried emotion, pleading, explanation, fear, and perhaps a small hope. He responded with a nod and a gentle smile, trying to show that he was listening. She looked at him, then pointed toward the forest outside. Her eyes widened, and she made a sound of urgency. He followed her gesture and realized she wanted to go outside, maybe to see the crash site or her craft. He hesitated. The forest was dark and dangerous at night. But he also understood that she needed to see something important, something he might not comprehend yet. He guided her outside slowly, supporting her injured arm. The cold night air brushed against her skin, and she shivered, but not from the cold alone. She looked at the broken craft with a mixture of relief and sadness. It was damaged beyond repair, and yet it had carried her safely, somehow. She knelt beside it, placing her hands over a glowing panel that still flickered weakly. Her fingers traced patterns over the surface, almost like a silent prayer. He watched quietly, giving her space, but he could not help but feel awe. The way she interacted with the craft, the reverence in her movements, made him realize she had come from somewhere far beyond his understanding. She was not just an ordinary being. She was royalty, a leader, someone whose life mattered in ways he could not imagine. Dot, as they returned to the cabin, he noticed her glancing around, studying everything. She seemed particularly interested in the small wooden tools he used: knives, a small pot, the simple stove. She touched them gently, inspecting their design. She did not mock or dismiss them. She observed. It was as if she was learning, trying to understand the ways of this human world, so different from her own. Over the next day, he focused on helping her regain strength. He cooked simple meals: soft porridge, fresh herbs, water heated over the stove. She ate slowly, carefully, as if savoring each bite. He noticed that when she ate, she would occasionally glance at him, perhaps acknowledging his effort. Though she could not speak his language, her actions communicated gratitude, and that was enough. Dot, he tried small experiments to see if she could respond to simple tasks. He handed her a cup and pointed to where it should go. She did it correctly, carefully placing the cup on the table. Then he asked her to take a cloth and clean a small spill he had made. She hesitated, but then did it with precision. It was clear she was capable, intelligent, and adaptable. Dot, at the same time, he sensed her fear. She flinched at sudden movements. Her eyes darted toward the forest as if expecting danger. He understood that she had survived a violent crash, alone and far from home. She needed reassurance, and he did his best to give it. He spoke softly, kept his movements slow and deliberate, and never touched her in a way that could be threatening. The night fell again, and the forest outside became dark and quiet. He lit the stove and offered her a small blanket. She accepted it, tucking it around her body, and for the first time he saw a small smile on her face. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a sign that trust was slowly growing. She tried again to communicate. This time, she drew symbols in the condensation on the window. He knelt beside her, watching carefully. The shapes were complex, swirling patterns that seemed to move as she traced them. He had no idea what they meant, but he could see that they were meaningful. She wanted to convey something important, and though he could not understand, he respected her effort. He realized that communication was more than words. It was gestures, expressions, shared moments, and trust. By staying calm, patient, and kind, he could bridge the gap between their worlds, even if only a little. He began to understand that saving her life was not just about tending wounds. It was about creating a sense of safety, of belonging, of understanding. Dot, by the second day, she was able to move more confidently. She explored the cabin cautiously, touching surfaces, opening small cupboards, and examining tools. Each action was deliberate, careful, as if she was cataloging everything. He watched her, impressed by her intelligence and adaptability. Even in her vulnerable state, she carried herself with dignity, and he found himself respecting her immensely. When he offered her a small walk outside, she agreed, leaning on him for support. The forest felt different during the day, lighter, safer. Birds sang, leaves rustled, and the sun filtered through the branches. She took slow steps, occasionally stopping to touch a tree or examine a leaf. He understood that even small things were extraordinary to her, a world of wonder she had never experienced before. During their time outside, she gestured toward the horizon, pointing to the sky and then to herself. He did not understand, but he realized she was probably trying to explain something about where she came from, or perhaps where she wanted to go. He nodded, silently agreeing to help her in any way he could, even if he did not fully understand the journey ahead. By the end of the day, she had regained a small measure of strength. She could stand unaided for a few minutes, move with more confidence, and even manage small gestures to communicate. He felt a sense of relief mixed with awe. This being, so far from her home and so advanced beyond his own world, was surviving partly because of him, but also because of her own resilience. As night fell again, she rested in the cabin. He sat nearby, watching over her as she slept. He thought about the impossibility of their situation. A human and an alien, sharing a small wooden cabin in a remote forest, learning to communicate without words, surviving together against the unknown. It was a bond that should not have existed, yet here it was, fragile and growing stronger with every passing moment. He realized that trust could be built slowly, carefully, through simple acts of care and patience. He did not know what the future held, whether her people would come looking, or whether danger lurked nearby. But for now, his focus was clear: to keep her alive, to help her regain strength, and to bridge the impossible gap between their worlds. And though neither of them could speak the same language, a silent understanding had begun to form a connection based not on words, but on shared humanity, courage, and compassion. As days passed, their strange companionship grew stronger. The human watched her carefully, making sure she was eating enough, drinking enough water, and moving slowly without hurting herself. He was surprised at how quickly she adapted to this simple life in the forest. She could not yet speak his language, but she learned the small routines: how to start a fire, fetch water from the stream, and even use the small tools he had shown her. Every small success was a moment of triumph for both of them. She, in return, began sharing parts of her world in ways he could understand. It was not through words, but through actions. She would take a leaf and hold it in front of him, then press her finger to it and show a small glowing symbol on her hand. The light flickered briefly, then disappeared. At first, he did not understand, but he realized she was trying to communicate something about energy or life. He could not replicate it, but he watched, fascinated. Sometimes she would stand in the clearing, stretching her arms to the sky, as if trying to feel the wind differently. He would watch from a distance, letting her have her moments. Occasionally, she would invite him to join her, holding out a hand and pointing to the sky. When he stood beside her, she would mimic some motion he made earlier, and he realized she was trying to build a shared understanding, a language of movement rather than words. Despite her curiosity and intelligence, there was always a shadow of fear. She flinched at loud sounds: thunder in the distance, the snap of a branch, or the sudden rustle of leaves. He would immediately raise a hand in calm, slow gestures, signaling that it was safe. Over time, she learned to trust him more. Sometimes she would even smile softly when he spoke gently or offered her food. That smile became a small reward, a sign that he was doing something right. One afternoon, she tried something new. She gathered small stones from the clearing and arranged them in patterns on the ground. He knelt beside her, observing quietly. The shapes were intricate, almost like a map, but it was clear they had meaning. She pointed to him, then to the patterns, then to herself. He could not understand the message, but he sensed she was trying to explain something about her past, or perhaps where she had come from. It was a silent story, one he could only watch and respect. He began speaking to her more frequently, even though she could not understand the words. "You're safe," he would say. "I won't leave you alone." His tone was calm and gentle. She responded with small nods, soft gestures, or even by mimicking the tone with her melodic sounds. Over time, these exchanges created a rhythm between them, a rhythm of care, trust, and patience. She also began observing him more closely. She noticed how he prepared food, how he repaired tools, how he moved through the forest. She would sometimes imitate his movements, even if imperfectly, as if learning the ways of this simple human world. At first, he thought it was amusing, but later he realized it was her way of connecting, of understanding him and his life. One morning, she tried to show him something extraordinary. She led him to the small clearing where she had first landed. There, she placed her hands on the ground, and a faint glow, emerged beneath her fingertips. The glow was subtle, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. He stared in awe. It was not fire, not electricity, something else, something alive. He didn't understand how it worked, but he understood its importance to her. She looked at him, eyes wide, and pointed to the sky, then to herself, then to him. She was showing him a piece of her world, sharing it as a gift of trust. He realized then that their bond had grown deeper than he expected. He was not just saving her life. He was learning from her, experiencing something beyond human understanding. And she, in turn, was learning to trust him, to depend on him in a world far from her own. But there were moments of tension as well. She sometimes became restless, pacing or gesturing toward the forest. He understood she wanted to move, to explore, perhaps even to find a way home. Yet he could not risk her wandering alone. The forest was unpredictable, dangerous. He gently guided her back to safety, showing patience even when she expressed frustration. Over time, she seemed to understand that he was not trying to control her, but to protect her. She also began to experiment with communication. She would draw patterns in the dirt, arrange sticks in lines, or use small rocks to indicate motion. He watched carefully, noting each attempt. He could not understand the exact meaning, but he respected her effort. He began responding with gestures of his own, pointing to objects, moving his hands in circles, or touching his heart. Slowly, a form of shared language began to emerge, built entirely on observation, patience, and mutual respect. At the same time, he noticed her intelligence in other ways. She could predict the weather by watching the clouds, identify which plants were safe to eat, and even understand how small changes in her environment affected the forest. He had lived here all his life, yet she could see patterns he had never noticed. It amazed him. He realized that despite her delicate appearance, she had a mind far beyond his own, capable of analyzing, learning, and adapting at incredible speed. He also began teaching her small skills from his own world. He showed her how to tie simple knots, how to carry water safely, and even how to start a fire from dry twigs. She watched intently, then practiced, sometimes failing at first, but improving quickly. He was impressed not only by her intelligence, but by her determination. Despite everything she had endured, she refused to give up, and that courage inspired him in return. Evenings became their time of quiet connection. He would sit near her as she rested, speaking softly, and she would respond with gestures or melodic sounds. Sometimes she would hum softly, a tune that seemed to carry both sorrow and hope. He would listen, feeling a strange peace in the sound, as if part of her story was reaching him even without words. As the third day came, she began exploring the cabin more freely. She opened drawers, examined objects, and even attempted to organize things in a way that made sense to her. He did not stop her. He realized that giving her small freedoms helped build trust and independence. She was learning about his world, and he was learning about her. Piece by piece, he noticed something remarkable. She began showing small acts of affection. When he offered food, she would place a hand lightly on his arm. When he guided her through the forest, she would follow his movements closely, almost mirroring him. These gestures were subtle but powerful, signaling trust, gratitude, and a growing bond. Yet, despite all this progress, there was always a hint of sadness in her eyes. She would occasionally look toward the sky, as if remembering a home she had lost or a life she could not yet return to. He understood the weight of that longing, and he never pressured her. Instead, he focused on the present, on helping her heal, understand, and survive. He also realized that his life was changing in ways he could not have imagined. He had lived quietly for years, thinking he understood simplicity. But this experience showed him that even the simplest life could hold extraordinary moments. Caring for her, learning from her, and bridging the gap between their worlds had given his life a new purpose. By the fourth day, she was stronger. She could walk farther, lift small objects, and even help with simple chores around the cabin. She had regained some independence, yet she still relied on him for guidance and protection. Their relationship was no longer just caretaker and patient. It was a partnership built on trust, patience, and understanding. One afternoon, she tried a new form of communication. She took a stick and carved small symbols into a piece of bark. He watched, fascinated, trying to interpret the meaning. She pointed to herself, then to him, then to the symbols. He realized she was attempting to share her story, piece by piece, using gestures and symbols. Though he could not understand it fully, he felt honored that she was opening her world to him. That night, as he sat by the fire, he thought about the bond they had created. It was fragile, delicate, yet strong. They had no words in common, no shared history, and yet they had found ways to connect, support, and understand each other. He knew that this connection was rare, perhaps impossible, but it had begun to grow between them, quietly and steadily. The human also sensed something unspoken. She was not just any being. She carried authority, dignity, and intelligence far beyond anything he had seen. He realized she was likely of high status in her own world, someone whose survival mattered greatly. This knowledge made him even more determined to protect her, to help her regain strength, and to support her in whatever way he could. By the fifth day, she was moving confidently, exploring the forest and the cabin, experimenting with gestures and learning small tasks. Their shared language of actions, symbols, and trust had grown stronger. He could now anticipate some of her needs, and she could follow his instructions with greater understanding. Yet, there was always a reminder that their worlds were different. She could not speak his language, and he could not speak hers. They could not fully understand each other's past, and the future was uncertain. But despite the gaps, they had created something remarkable, a connection built on care, respect, and the simple human desire to help another being in need. And as the night fell on the forest once more, they sat side by side, watching the stars. Though they could not speak, the silence between them was filled with understanding. She rested her hand on the grue. The forest was quiet that morning, with mist curling among the trees and sunlight just beginning to peek through the branches. He had been awake early, as usual, checking the small fire and making sure the cabin was in order. She was already moving around, stretching slowly and examining the few plants that grew nearby. He noticed a new sense of confidence in her movements. She could now walk without leaning too heavily on him, and her curiosity seemed stronger than ever. But something in the air was different. He felt it before he saw it, a shift in the forest, a faint vibration that made the hairs on his arms rise. The birds had gone silent, and even the rustle of the leaves seemed muted. He looked toward the horizon and noticed a strange light moving through the trees, not like the sun, not like any natural reflection he had seen before. She stopped her exploration abruptly and turned toward him, eyes wide. She pointed toward the forest, then to the sky, then back at herself, her tone urgent and sharp. Though he could not understand her words, her meaning was clear. Someone or something was coming. Moments later, a noise broke the quiet. A humming, low but powerful, grew louder as a shape emerged from the mist. It was a large craft, unlike her own damaged one, and it moved with precision and authority. He instinctively stepped forward, shielding her behind him. She did not flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her expression firm, as if preparing to confront whatever was arriving. The craft landed in the clearing with a soft thud, and a figure stepped out. Unlike her, this being was taller, broader, and radiated authority. His presence commanded attention. Every movement was calculated, controlled, and powerful. He scanned the forest with sharp eyes until they landed on the queen. His expression changed instantly from curiosity to anger, then disbelief. She stepped forward slightly, placing herself partially between him and the human. The human did not move, but his body tensed, ready to protect her if necessary. The king, because he realized almost immediately that this being was of the same species. And clearly, the leader approached slowly, his gaze fixed on the queen. "You're here," he said, his voice deep and resonant, though the human could not understand the words. The queen responded with a series of tones, soft but urgent, pointing first at herself, then at the human, then at the forest. The king's eyes widened in shock as he slowly pieced together what had happened. He had expected to find her captured, hurt, or worse. He had sent his fleet to search for her, assuming that no one from a primitive world could save her. And yet, here she was, alive, healthy, and standing beside a human, this simple, unarmed human, who had protected her when no advanced force could. His pride and authority were shaken, replaced by disbelief and confusion. The queen, noticing his reaction, gestured toward the human again. She made a series of tones and soft movements, showing how he had cared for her, healed her, and kept her safe. She pointed at her wound, then at the human's hands, then at the cabin, emphasizing the care he had provided. The king stared, his jaw tightening as he tried to reconcile what he saw. The human, sensing tension, stepped slightly forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. He did not speak, but his posture communicated the simple truth. He meant no harm, and he had only done what was right. The queen's subtle gestures reinforced this message. She did not demand protection from the king. She wanted the king to see the truth of what had happened. The king's expression softened slightly, but his shock remained. He had never imagined that a being from such a primitive world could possess the courage, patience, and wisdom necessary to save his queen. In his advanced world, power was measured in technology, fleets, and strategy. And yet, here was proof that compassion and bravery could surpass even the most sophisticated tools. He stepped closer, careful not to appear threatening, yet his presence alone was overwhelming. The queen remained beside the human, unafraid, her posture proud. She gestured toward him once more, using her language of gestures and tones to explain the events of the past days. The human watched quietly, realizing that she was speaking not to him, but to her king, bridging a gap that words could never fully cover. The king finally spoke again, his voice quieter this time, tinged with awe. He gestured to the human, then to the queen, then back at himself, as if questioning the reality of what he had witnessed. His eyes softened as he realized the depth of the bond that had formed between the human and the queen. She had survived because of him, because of his simple acts of care, patience, and courage. The queen stepped forward and placed a hand gently on the human's arm, a gesture of gratitude and protection. The king watched, understanding that this being, though primitive in every measurable sense, had demonstrated qualities that even he admired. Pride, bravery, compassion, these were not measured by technology or power, but by action. For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence. The human felt the weight of the king's gaze, the queen's presence beside him, and the forest around them. He realized that this encounter was extraordinary, unlike anything he could have imagined. He was just a simple man, living a quiet life, yet he had become a central part of a story that spanned worlds. The king finally moved closer to the queen, his posture softening. He did not speak harshly, and his movements lacked the sharpness of command. Instead, he observed the human with cautious respect, acknowledging the impossible truth. This human had saved his queen when no one else could. The queen gestured toward the human once more, clearly expressing that he should be acknowledged for his actions. The king's eyes widened slightly, then he nodded, a subtle but profound gesture of recognition. He stepped closer to the human, extending a hand not in threat, but in respect. The human hesitated briefly, then reached out. Their hands met, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Words were unnecessary. The king recognized bravery, and the human understood honor. The queen's eyes softened, showing relief and gratitude that the tension had finally eased. The forest around them seemed to breathe again. The wind rustling the leaves, birds returning to the trees, and sunlight breaking through the mist. For a brief moment, everything felt still, calm, and right. The impossible had happened. A primitive human had saved a queen, and the king had come to understand and respect that truth. After a while, the king gestured toward the queen, then toward his craft, signaling that it was time to leave. The queen nodded, but she glanced at the human, her gaze filled with gratitude and something deeper, an acknowledgement that their bond was not to be forgotten. She made soft tones, explaining in her way that he had saved her life and that she would remember him always. The human watched as she prepared to leave, assisted by the king. He realized that their paths might never cross again, yet he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had acted out of compassion and courage, not knowing what the consequences might be. And now he had changed the course of a story that spanned worlds. As the king's craft lifted from the clearing, the queen looked back once more. Their eyes met, and in that silent glance, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. Trust, gratitude, respect, and the recognition of an extraordinary bond. The human stood alone in the clearing, the forest around him alive and vibrant, yet forever changed by what had just occurred. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight and beauty of something truly remarkable. He had been part of an encounter that no one would believe, a story that spanned worlds and defied expectations. And though the queen was leaving, and the king had returned to his realm, their shared experience remained, etched into his memory and his heart. That evening, as he sat by the fire in his cabin, he reflected on the events of the day. He thought about the courage it took for her to trust him, the patience he had shown, and the respect the king had finally granted. He realized that bravery and kindness could transcend even the vastest differences, and that sometimes the simplest acts could have the greatest impact. Though the forest was quiet and the night still, he knew that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. He had witnessed something beyond comprehension, something that would stay with him forever. And somewhere, far away in the stars, a queen remembered him, a king respected him, and an impossible bond had been forged, bridging worlds and hearts in ways that words could never fully capture. The queen and her king had returned to their craft, hovering just above the ground, the forest beneath them shrinking in size as they prepared to leave. Yet the queen's eyes kept drifting back toward the human who had saved her life. She could not stop thinking about him, about the courage he had shown, and the patience he had offered when she was weak and confused. She knew that without his care, she might not have survived the crash, and the entire sequence of events that had brought them together could have ended tragically. The king, still towering and imposing, had regained some of his composure. His anger had faded, replaced by astonishment and a reluctant respect for the human who had defied every expectation. Yet there was also unease in his expression. Pride had always been the foundation of his leadership. To realize that a primitive being, a simple human, had accomplished what even his advanced fleet could not, challenged everything he believed about strength, authority, and survival. As the craft stabilized, the queen gestured toward the human once more. Her tones were soft but clear in their intent, carrying a meaning beyond words. She pointed to him, then to herself, then back to him, repeating the sequence slowly, emphasizing the truth she wanted her king to understand. The king watched, eyebrows furrowed, as her gestures continued, each one deliberate, each one conveying gratitude, explanation, and acknowledgement that he finally understood. The human had saved her when no one else could. Every advanced system, every weapon, every strategy had failed to protect the queen. Only this simple, unarmed being, relying on compassion, care, and intuition, had succeeded. It was an unfamiliar sensation for the king to feel humility, to recognize that power and technology were not the ultimate measures of courage or worth. The queen stepped slightly forward, her gaze unwavering. She pointed at the human again, then at her own wound, then at the cabin where he had tended her. Her melodic tones emphasized the events that had taken place, how he had cleaned her injury, fed her, provided shelter, and ensured her safety when she was most vulnerable. The king's eyes widened further as he slowly pieced together the sequence. The human, standing below the craft, felt the weight of their gaze. He did not speak, nor did he move abruptly. Instead, he simply lifted a hand in a gesture of peace, showing that he had no intention to fight or interfere. His calmness, his steady presence, seemed to confirm everything the queen had been trying to convey. He had acted not out of fear or expectation of reward, but out of instinctive care for another being in need. The king's expression softened in stages. His jaw, once tight with anger, now relaxed. His shoulders, rigid from tension, eased slightly. He was beginning to grasp the full significance of what had happened. This human had demonstrated qualities that were rare, qualities that even in an advanced civilization could be overlooked: bravery, patience, empathy, and moral courage. The queen moved closer to the edge of the craft, reaching toward the human with one hand. Her gesture was gentle, almost reverent, and carried a clear message. This human deserved recognition, and his actions mattered. She wanted her king to understand that the human had not merely survived chance encounters or accidents. He had actively made choices that saved her life. That created hope where none existed. The king studied her carefully, noting the calm confidence in her posture and the clarity in her gestures. It was undeniable. She was telling the truth, and his own experience confirmed it. She was alive, whole, and standing beside a being he had once dismissed as insignificant. His pride, the very foundation of his authority, faced a challenge unlike any before. After a moment of silence, the king made a subtle gesture toward the human, inviting him to step closer. The human obeyed cautiously, aware that this was a delicate moment. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible and his posture relaxed, signaling that he meant no harm. The queen's eyes shone with approval, as if to say, "This is right. He deserves this." The king spoke, his words slow and deliberate, though the human could not understand them. His tone, however, carried respect, acknowledgement, and a quiet humility. He extended a hand, not in command, but in recognition. The human hesitated briefly, then placed his hand against the king's. It was a simple act, yet it carried profound meaning. A bridge had been formed between two worlds, one built not on fear or dominance, but on respect and shared understanding. The queen watched, her expression softening. She gestured toward the human once more, pointing at him and herself, then the king, repeating the sequence to emphasize the truth. This human had acted with courage and compassion, without expectation, and had saved her life. The king nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her message, and finally turned his full attention to the human, as if seeing him for the first time as an equal in terms of moral strength. The human felt a strange mix of emotions. He had never sought recognition or reward. All he had wanted was to ensure she survived. Yet standing there, acknowledged by beings from a world far beyond his own, he realized the impact of his actions. Courage and kindness, he understood, could resonate across boundaries, across species, and even across the vastness of space. The queen then made another series of gestures, this time emphasizing the bond that had formed between them. She pointed to her heart, then to the human, then raised her hand to the sky, showing that their connection was meaningful, enduring, and significant. The king's eyes followed her movements carefully. He understood that their relationship was more than survival. It was trust, respect, and a shared experience that transcended their differences. For a long moment, silence settled over the clearing. The only sounds were the faint hum of the craft, the rustle of the trees, and the distant calls of birds returning to the forest. The human stood quietly, aware of the enormity of the situation, while the queen's gaze remained on him, expressing gratitude in ways words could never capture. The king, finally, took a deep breath, acknowledging the truth with a slow nod. The queen gestured toward the human again, this time with a small glowing fragment she had taken from her craft. It pulsed softly in her hand, a symbol of honor in her culture. She offered it to him, and he reached out carefully, accepting it. The glow warmed his hands and seemed to convey the depth of her appreciation. It was not just a gift, it was a recognition of his courage, a tangible reminder that his actions had mattered on a scale he could never have imagined. The king watched closely, his expression now a mixture of awe and humility. He gestured toward the queen, then back at the human, signaling that this acknowledgement was rare and significant. Even in his advanced world, leaders did not often recognize the worth of beings so different from themselves. Yet here, before his eyes, he had no choice but to honor the truth. The queen made one final gesture, soft and deliberate, signaling that she was ready to leave, but would never forget what the human had done. She stepped back toward the craft, her hand brushing briefly against the human's shoulder, a farewell, a thank you, and a promise that their bond would endure. The king moved alongside her, supporting her as she prepared for departure. Yet his gaze remained fixed on the human, acknowledging the role he had played in an event that would be remembered in their world for a long time. As the craft lifted slowly, the human remained on the ground, watching it ascend into the sky. He felt a strange emptiness, but also a profound sense of fulfillment. He had done what he could, without expecting recognition, yet the acknowledgement he had received from beings so far beyond his understanding made the moment unforgettable. The queen's eyes met his one last time, filled with gratitude, respect, and something deeper, a connection that no distance, no language, and no difference could ever erase. Once the craft disappeared into the horizon, the forest returned to its quiet, ordinary state. Yet for the human, nothing felt ordinary anymore. His life had been forever changed by the extraordinary events he had witnessed and the bond he had formed. He realized that courage, kindness, and patience could create ripples far beyond his own world, and that sometimes the simplest actions could have the greatest consequences. He returned to his cabin slowly, reflecting on everything that had happened. He thought about the queen, her resilience and intelligence, about the king, his astonishment and eventual humility, and about himself, a simple human who had acted out of instinct and compassion. He felt a quiet pride, not arrogance, but satisfaction that he had lived according to his own values and had made a real difference in another being's life. That night, as he sat by the fire, he gazed at the stars. Somewhere among them, the queen was traveling home, carrying stories of courage, gratitude, and unexpected friendship. The king had returned to his responsibilities, yet he had witnessed a truth that would remain with him forever, that even the smallest, simplest beings could shape events in ways unimaginable. The human understood that his life would continue quietly, as it had before, yet he also knew that he had been part of something extraordinary. He had bridged worlds, formed a connection that defied expectation, and demonstrated that courage and kindness could resonate across the vastness of space. And in the quiet of the forest, under the endless sky, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that what he had done mattered far more than he could ever have imagined. The days after the queen and king departed felt strangely quiet in the forest. The human returned to his usual routine, tending the small cabin, fetching water from the stream, chopping wood, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. Every step he took, every breath he drew, reminded him of the incredible events he had witnessed and the bond that had formed across worlds. Though the queen had left, her presence lingered, not as a physical being, but as a memory, a symbol of trust, courage, and gratitude. He spent mornings walking through the forest, observing the trees, the birds, and the small animals that moved quietly around him. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before: the way sunlight struck the leaves, the patterns of moss on rocks, the gentle ripple of water in the stream. Every detail seemed alive, vibrant, and full of meaning. He realized that life itself felt more precious, more intricate, after experiencing the fragility and wonder of hers. Sometimes he would pause and look up at the sky, imagining the queen traveling among the stars. He thought about the king and how he had seen the truth. The courage of someone so ordinary had earned respect in a world so far beyond his own. The human could not help but smile quietly. He had acted with nothing more than instinct, empathy, and care, yet it had resonated across galaxies. The sheer improbability of it amazed him, and yet it had happened. One afternoon, as he rested near the stream, he noticed a faint shimmer in the water, almost like a reflection, but more vibrant. At first, he thought it was sunlight, but the shimmer moved differently, almost like a small pulse. He knelt closer and saw a tiny fragment of light floating above the water, glowing softly. It was the piece of the queen's craft she had left him, a gift, a reminder, a symbol. It pulsed gently, as if acknowledging him, and he felt warmth in his heart. He held it carefully, understanding that it was more than a trinket. It was a token of trust, honor, and connection. The fragment reminded him of the nights he had spent caring for the queen, of the careful steps he had taken to ensure she survived. He remembered her soft tones, her delicate gestures, and the way she had learned from him just as much as he had learned from her. He remembered the moments of fear, the moments of awe, and the moments of silent understanding that had passed between them. That light in his hand seemed to capture all of it, glowing softly as if carrying the memory itself. Though the queen had returned to her world, he felt a responsibility to live differently now. He began to think not just of survival, but of action, of kindness, and of courage in daily life. If a single human could save a queen from across the stars, then surely small actions in his own world could make a difference too. He became more aware of the people around him, the animals, and even the forest itself. He noticed how everything depended on care, attention, and patience. He also reflected on the king's presence. The king had been shocked, then humbled, and eventually respectful. He had learned something profound. Strength was not always measured by power or technology. True courage, compassion, and understanding could exist even in those the world might consider weak or insignificant. The human realized that this lesson was universal, not just for the king or for the queen, but for himself as well. Every day offered the chance to act with integrity, to choose empathy, and to make a meaningful impact. Over time, the human began to incorporate new routines into his life. He built small improvements in the cabin, organized his surroundings more carefully, and created systems for gathering and storing food. Yet he did so thoughtfully, reflecting on the patience and precision the queen had shown when learning about his world. He treated the forest and its creatures with care, thinking of the queen's lessons in observation and respect for life. Sometimes, he imagined the queen in distant worlds, attending to her duties as a leader. He thought about how she must share her experiences with others, how the king must have returned with stories of a human who defied expectation. These thoughts brought both pride and humility. He had not acted for recognition, yet the knowledge that his actions might inspire beings in another world was profoundly moving. On quiet evenings, he would sit by the fire, holding the glowing fragment from her craft. He traced its patterns with his fingers, remembering the delicate glow of her presence, the soft tones of her speech, and the moments when trust had passed silently between them. He realized that even though their worlds were far apart, their connection had created a bridge that neither time nor distance could erase. The human also reflected on his own growth. Before meeting her, he had lived simply, cautiously, with a sense of routine. He had never imagined that his instincts and empathy could carry such weight or have consequences so vast. Yet the events of those days had shown him that courage could exist quietly, without recognition or reward, and still change the world or even the universe in ways unimaginable. He began noticing small acts of kindness in his daily life more clearly. Helping an injured animal, sharing food with travelers passing through the forest, or tending to a sick neighbor, all of these moments felt richer now. He realized that the same principles that had guided him in caring for the queen patients, observation, empathy, could transform ordinary life into something extraordinary. One day, while gathering firewood, he noticed tracks in the soil strange, unfamiliar, yet deliberate. His heart quickened, but he reminded himself to stay calm, just as he had with the queen. The tracks led him to a clearing where a small light shimmered briefly before vanishing. He understood instantly. It was a message from the queen, a subtle acknowledgement that she remembered him, that their bond endured, and that she valued the courage he had shown. The human felt a deep warmth and satisfaction. Though he could not speak her language, and she could not remain in his world, the connection between them transcended words, distance, and even species. It was built on shared experience, trust, and the simple act of caring for another being when it mattered most. That understanding gave his life a new depth, a quiet sense of purpose, and a lasting memory he would cherish forever. As months passed, he continued his life in the forest. Yet every action was now informed by the lessons he had learned. He moved with patience, observed with attention, and acted with empathy. The glowing fragment remained in a safe place near his cabin, a symbol of courage, connection, and the extraordinary potential of small, thoughtful actions. Sometimes, during the stillness of the night, he would look up at the stars and imagine the queen in her distant world, sharing the story of a human who had saved her life. He imagined the king reflecting on his own assumptions and learning that strength and honor were not measured solely by power. These thoughts brought a quiet joy, a sense of fulfillment, and a reassurance that their actions, though separated by light years, had lasting meaning. He also realized that the experience had transformed him profoundly. He had begun life as a cautious, simple man, but through courage, empathy, and trust, he had become part of a story that spanned worlds. He understood that ordinary beings could make extraordinary differences, and that every act of kindness, no matter how small, carried significance beyond immediate understanding. In the quiet evenings, as the wind rustled through the forest and the fire flickered in the cabin, he felt a deep sense of peace. The queen had returned safely, the king had learned humility, and he had fulfilled a role far beyond what he could have imagined. The memory of her presence, the glow of her fragment, and the lessons of courage and trust would remain with him forever, shaping the way he lived, moved, and acted. And so life continued simple, quiet, yet profound. Each day held ordinary routines, yet every moment was enriched by the extraordinary experience of saving a life, bridging worlds, and forming a connection that defied expectation. The human carried forward the lessons he had learned, that courage was not measured by power, that trust could overcome fear, and that empathy could resonate across even the vastest distances. He understood that his story, though quiet and unremarkable to the outside world, had echoes that reached beyond his forest, beyond his understanding, and into the lives of beings far beyond his imagination. And in that understanding, he found a sense of purpose, fulfillment, and quiet joy that would last a lifetime. The forest, the stars, and the small cabin all seemed brighter now, alive with possibility. The memory of the queen, the respect of the king, and the silent acknowledgement of their bond reminded him daily that the universe was vast, mysterious, and full of extraordinary moments waiting to be discovered. And in his heart, he knew that he had been part of something truly remarkable, a story of courage, compassion, and connection that transcended worlds, species, and expectation. Even as seasons changed, the glowing fragment remained near the fire, pulsing softly as a reminder that bravery and kindness were never wasted. Every time he looked at it, he remembered the queen's gentle presence, the king's humbled gaze, and the extraordinary truth that a simple human could save a life, create respect, and leave a lasting impact on worlds far beyond his own. And in that quiet, reflective life, he realized a simple truth. Extraordinary bonds are formed not through power or expectation, but through courage, care, and the willingness to act when it matters most. His heart, forever touched by the queen, forever respected by the king, and forever changed by their S.